Why don't we go ahead and get started, and people can join as we go. I think I know most of you, but just in case, I'm Don Isaac, the Executive Director of the Office of Research and Grants, and really pleased to host our sabbatical presentation with Dr. Rico Vitz today. The presentation is being recorded, and it'll be posted on the ORG YouTube channel. Just the presentation, not all the audience and things, unless you're asking questions or something. And I'll make sure that link is sent in the chat room in case you want to see it, because there's all our sabbatical presentations are there. So Dr. Vitz is a professor of philosophy in the Honors College. He has a BA in philosophy from Cal State University, Dominguez Hills, where he also minored in music. That's interesting. He has an MS in philosophy from the University of Utah and a Ph.D. in philosophy from UC Riverside. He's been an APU faculty continuously since 2011, although he was also a visiting faculty for 1 year in academic year 2005-06 here at APU. And then between 2006 and 2011, he went to the other side of the United States and was a faculty at the University of North Florida. He's a productive and engaging scholar. His resume includes 6 pages that lists special presentations, seminars, interviews, and panels he's participated in. And he's also authored more than 20 book chapters or journal articles. He's published 4 book reviews. And he's authored, edited, or co-edited 4 additional books. A couple titles I might just run by you. One is Reforming the Art of Living, Nature, Virtue, and Religion in Descartes' Epistemology, that he published in 2015 with Springer. And another book is Turning East, Contemporary Philosophers and the Ancient Christian Faith. And that was interesting, among other, for several reasons. One being that that one, as I understand, was translated into 2 languages, one being Greek and the other being Romanian. Among the most satisfying accomplishments of Dr. Vitz's academic career is his work in mentoring excellent students. And that includes a dozen or so who have either earned their PhDs or in the process of doing so. He also considers his life having been significantly enriched by Eastern cultures, and he highlights in that regard 2 distinctives. First, reading Christian philosophy and the theology of the Near East deeply influenced and enriched his religious life, ultimately leading him, according to Dr. Vitz, to Orthodox Christianity. And second, he notes that he is married to, quote, I'll quote him on this, a remarkably beautiful Korean-American woman who continually enriches and transforms my soul. And so today, Dr. Vitz is going to speak to us in his sabbatical presentation on sympathy and solidarity, Hume, Confucianism, and African-American social philosophy. And hopefully we'll have time at the end for a few minutes of question and answer. Dr. Vitz.
Thanks, Don.
Rico.
Yeah, thanks. So I am going to share my screen here. Okay, so now I have to move you so I can see what I'm doing. All right. So if all goes well, let me start, only testing out the title and then start by giving a little bit of context of what's going on. So the principal sort of focus of my sabbatical project was on sympathy and compassion in Hume and in classical Confucianism. By the end of my sabbatical, the project had changed a little bit to focus principally on sympathy and solidarity, and that had changed in part for reasons I'll explain in a minute about me reading more in African-American social philosophy. So that's, if you look at the title and think, how did you get to that sort of interesting goulash of thoughts there. Hume, classical Confucianism, and African American social philosophy. That's what's going on. And I'll sort of explain. So let me give some context for beginners. So the fundamental elements of the project that I just hinted at began with one of the figures I do research on. So I do research principally on two figures from the 17th and 18th century in European philosophy. One of them is Descartes. Don mentioned my book on Descartes in the intro, but the other is David Hume, who's a figure in the Scottish Enlightenment. There he is, looking noble with his turban and not his powdered wig. So that's my principal area of specialization. But for reasons that I'll clarify later, I've also developed a sort of competence and interest in classical Confucian philosophy. So the figure on the top in that little set of pictures is the master himself, Confucius. On the bottom left, we have one of his disciples, Mencius or Mengse, and on the bottom right, we have Chunse. So that sort of package of figures and works became interesting to me. And what was interesting is to see the connection. So historically, there's a Silk Road travel route that would connect, a trade route that would connect China in the east to Europe in the west, right? So there's a Silk Road connection. And there wasn't just, it's not just for economic trade, right? But there's social interest trade. So there's a tourist picture of me in Beijing at the second largest Confucian temple in China. That's the Beijing temple. And that's Confucius there. So the project is me sort of trying to connect the thoughts in these two different realms, right? And it's particularly important to me, not just academically, but personally, for one reason, as Don mentioned, that I am Korean by marriage. I don't know if my wife can officially convey that, but I am Korean by marriage, according to my wife. If you're straining Adam, that is my mother-in-law and my father-in-law in that picture on the top. That is baby Rico and my beautiful wife Rose on the left, and those are my two not so small anymore sons. Their Korean names are Sokchun and Hochun. So Confucian philosophy is interesting to me academically, but it's interesting to me because it's shaped my life and the life of people I love. That's one reason. So there's a personal connection to family. There's also a personal connection to my faith. I have to move you here. Pardon 1 second. One of the things that's interesting to me, Don had mentioned my interest in reading Near Eastern philosophical and religious text, is the influence of a figure named Saint Isaac of Syria. So it's in a number of figures, but Saint Isaac of Syria is, I think, a particularly notable one in my life. So this is a quote from one of his ascetical homilies. He's a Syrian figure who wrote in the 7th century. I find this both inspiring and frightening. It's a convicting quote. What is a merciful heart? It's the heart's burning desire for the sake of the entire creation, for men, for birds, for animals, for demons, and for every created thing. And at the recollection and sight of them, the eyes of a merciful man pour forth abundant tears from the strong and vehement mercy that grips his heart, and from his great compassion. His heart is humbled, and he cannot bear to hear or to see any injury or slight sorrow in creation. For this reason, he offers up prayers with tears continually, because of the great compassion that burns without measure in his heart in the likeness of God. Reflecting on Confucian philosophy, on Hume and Confucian philosophy, I think is interesting academically. It's important to me personally, but I think it's also important, or can be important, or can be transformative, I think, for Christians insofar as it provides a sort of a way of thinking or rethinking about parts of the faith I think that get overlooked. So the formation of the heart, the affective aspect of. All right, looks like I just got disconnected. Are we back? I was disconnected momentarily. I lost everybody. All right, go back to where we were. All right, back to where we were. Hopefully no more internet problems. Move some things around. Okay. Okay, so here's the framing of the big project. I'll sort of describe the work I was doing and then try to focus in on the small part of the project that I'm going to talk about today. So the big project goes like this. It divides up into two parts. There's a part that's principally interpretive and a part that then sort of extends the interpretation of Hume. And since my principal area of specialization is on Hume, my focus is on providing a reading of Hume, what we can learn from Hume. A principal, I think, difference in this reading of Hume is sometimes when people do this is called comparative philosophy, when you do sort of comparative philosophy between two different figures or cultures. There's a kind of, you take one figure, say Hume, right, and then try to see how does these other figures, these Eastern figures, fit into to Hume's philosophy or Hume's story or the concepts that Hume's talking about. I think those kind of projects are interesting. There's some of those projects that exist. What I want to do is ask, what kind of questions would we ask? What kind of themes would we focus on if we didn't let Hume hold that sort of privileged methodological place? So what if we focused on his texts, but we allowed the methodology to be principally shaped by classical Confucianism? I think we look at different themes in Hume. So I think we look at things like family and friendship in Hume in a way, and rituals and traditions in a way that I think most Hume scholarship doesn't. And so that's what's going on in the text. I'm not going to say too much of that, just in the interest of time. There's a lot of stuff I want to get to. I'll come back to what's going on in part one. But after providing an interpretation in part one, there's the work of sort of extending that project. Or I think that one of the interesting things about the history of ideas is to mine it, so we can understand traditional past cultures and traditions, but to kind of move forward, see what we can learn from them moving forward. So in today's talk, I want to focus on some material from just 4 of these chapters in a kind of narrative that runs through those 4 chapters. And so chapter 2 focuses on some issues in moral psychology. Chapter 5 focuses on some issues about human cognition that's related to that aspect of human psychology. And then chapter 7 deals with sort of limitations that emerge out of this reflection on human psychology and human cognition. And then chapter 8 tries to think of a way forward. So what follows is going to be essentially 4 things. I'm going to say a little bit about this aspect of human affection. I'm going to say some comments about the related aspect of human cognition, problematize the reading that comes out of this part of the book, and then suggest a way forward. So that's what's going to go on. So this is the part about, this is from chapter 2 on moral psychology. So Mencius has, there's a kind of classic story in the Mencius where he's focusing on a story that he thinks illustrates something fundamental about the way humans are wired up. So he tells a story and he says, suppose someone suddenly saw a child about to fall into a well. Anyone in such a situation would have a feeling of alarm and compassion, not because one sought to get in good with the child's parents, not because one wanted fame among one's neighbors and friends, and not because one would dislike the sound of the child's cries, so not for any egoistic or self-serving reason, so thinks Mencius. From this, we can see that if one is without the feeling of compassion, one is not human. So Mencius thinks that this feeling of compassion is a fundamental aspect of what makes somebody a human being. Right? What he does, Mencius does something that's common in classical Confucian philosophy. It's also common in ancient Greek philosophy. You see something similar going on in Plato, where you make some empirical observations about human psychology and draw some inferences, connections to human virtues. So Mencius gives an account of what he calls the 4 sprouts, or these 4 fundamental psychological faculties. And he thinks that he gives a story about from each of these 4 faculties, there is a related virtue. Right? So these are the cardinal virtues of classical Confucian philosophy, slightly different set of classical virtues than you get in Plato, right? Because Plato has a slightly different emphasis on the things he's looking at in psychology. The one I want to focus on today a little bit is just this connection between compassion, seyin, and benevolence, what's translated as benevolence or humanity, ren. I'm going to focus on that theme. The reason that I think this theme is particularly interesting in relationship to Hume is because Hume has a couple passages that sound strikingly similar to Mencius on this account. So consider this one. This is one. And remember, he's writing 2 millennia later, and halfway across the globe from where Mencius is writing. And I don't know that Hume has any knowledge of Mencius when he's writing. Supposing I saw a person perfectly unknown to me who, while asleep in the fields, was in danger of being trod underfoot by horses. I should immediately run to his assistance, and in this I should be actuated by the same principle of sympathy, which makes me concerned for the present sorrows of a stranger. So it's what Mencius calls compassion, what gets translated as compassion. Hume is calling sympathy. And notice sympathy isn't just a feeling with somebody, but a feeling for, more importantly, a feeling for somebody, a feeling for that motivates us to action. Similar kind of theme in Hume. The connection between, this is highlighting the connection between sympathy and the virtue of humanity or benevolence. The social virtues of humanity and benevolence exert their influence immediately by a direct tendency or instinct, which chiefly keeps in view the simple object, moving the affections, and comprehends not any scheme or system, the kind of things that Mencius was noting in his passage, nor the consequences resulting from the concurrence, imitation, or example of others. And then Hume gives this as an example. Sounds very familiar, right? A parent flies to the relief of his child, transported by that natural sympathy which actuates him, right? So there's a similar sort of kind of theme emerging in both of these figures about human psychology and the virtue associated with that aspect of human psychology. So it looks like this. You move from making an observation about a particular psychological faculty, seyin, or compassion in Mencius, sympathy in Hume, and you make observations about the connection of that to a virtue, what gets translated as benevolence or humanity, Ren in classical Confucianism, and what Hume calls humanity. Okay, so that's a little bit of the similarity, the comparison between aspects of human affection, human psychology, moral psychology. Second point has to do with sympathetic understanding. So Mencius, I'm going to focus principally on Mencius here. Hume has a similar kind of account, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip that. Mencius realizes that although we have this capacity to feel with and for others, it doesn't get activated sort of automatically. That thing has to be cultivated. Right? So there's a classical sort of encounter between Mencius. Mencius would travel, and he would counsel civic leaders. So there's a question that he addresses at one point in the Mencius. How does one learn to govern benevolently? And benevolently doesn't mean like as a nice person or something. It has a technical meaning. It means how does one govern virtuously, right? With the principal cardinal virtue of Ren. And the discussion is between King Xuan and Mencius, and it concerns an ox. And Mencius makes this observation, right? The king is concerned that he isn't capable of governing benevolently, so he doesn't properly care for his subjects. And Mencius says, this isn't true. And to illustrate that this isn't true, Mencius says, look, I heard a story about you where there was going to be an ox that was sacrificed for a particular feast or celebration. And when the ox was brought through, the king looked into the eyes of the ox and thought, I don't want to see this animal suffer. And so the king asked for a different animal to be slaughtered in the place of this ox. And what Mencius says to the king is, look, why did you do that? You did that because you had compassion for the ox, right? So you do have a heart of compassion. Your problem is that you don't know how, you haven't cultivated it so it feels properly for your subjects. Right? So you have to cultivate this heart of compassion. How do you go about cultivating this heart of compassion is a sort of question that gets left over here. And one of there are sort of three concepts that Mencius tries to put into play in trying to counsel King Xuan. So here's the way this works. The first thing to note is that for Mencius, and this is also true for Hume, there's not this distinct. We live in a world in the sort of English-speaking world in the U.S. In the last 200 years, where there's this sort of like head and heart dichotomy, right? Well, the head does one thing, the heart does another thing, right? Those are two kinds of things. And if you're influenced by certain philosophers like Kant, you might think, in fact, you don't want the heart to influence you. That's a bad source of moral motivation. Only the head, right? That is not present for Mencius, right? For Mencius, Xin is the heart mind. It is one thing. It is one faculty, right? There's one faculty. There are different aspects of the faculty, but it is one faculty. So there's not this sort of separation of what we would call head and heart. So the thinking about human nature is different, right? The principal faculty by which we think is also the principal faculty by which we feel. And you can't just, you can't separate those in the way that Kant thinks you can later. Okay, so with that particular faculty, Xin, you need to engage in reflection. You have to think, so in the case of King Xuan, you have to think about your people, what kind of circumstances they're in, what kind of suffering they face. If you train your heart, if you train your mind, right, you train your Xin to reflect on the conditions of your people, you can develop what's called sympathetic understanding, Shu. Right? If you develop sympathetic understanding, sympathetic understanding is right, it is where you have human affection and human cognition united in one kind of act, right? Where the heart mind is functioning to sympathetically understand the situation of another. If someone can do that, if King Xuan can learn to do that, if we can learn to do that, Mencius thinks, then we can experience compassion that will lead us to benevolence or humanity. So that's the story that Mencius has going on. And Hume has a similar story, which I'm going to omit for interest of time. And I think that is a remarkably inspiring picture of how empirical observations about human nature inform us about the way humans can act. The bummer is that pretty picture is flawed. Right? It's flawed, at least in the sense of being incomplete. So let me talk a little bit about that. This is the third thing I mentioned I was going to talk about. So this is a section on moral inclusion and relational humility. So I was having a nice time doing research on my sabbatical when this joker came along, that one in the middle. That joker in the middle and I were getting ready, we're having coffee. Right, so this joker in the middle is APU alumna Marissa Espinosa. She is future Dr. Espinosa is a Ph.D. candidate at St. Louis University in the program in healthcare ethics. It's my shout out both to Marissa, who I think is on this call, and to St. Louis University. That's for you too, Adam. So we were talking, and she was doing some research on Mia Sosa Provencio, and the problems of moral inclusion, like how to make sure you're not, how to make sure in the terms we're talking about, how to make sure you actually can properly cultivate sympathetic understanding. Can you properly cultivate sympathetic understanding given these sort of insider outsider type of concerns? That conversation led me back to some work that Anne Jacobson had done. Anne had contributed a chapter to a book that I edited on Hume's moral philosophy and contemporary psychology. So I'm going to let Anne set up the problem. I'm going to let Mia Sosa Provencio deepen the problem, and then identify a way that I think the problem could be addressed. This is the extending the Hume project. And the last part is compliments of Marissa, so I thank her for that. So first part, let's think about what is the problem here. Well, Anne says this: those who are not familiar with the experience of being excluded on a significant scale might initially think that the issue of extending our moral concern to outsiders is quite simple. We just exercise our reason and our compassion, as Bloom will say. Or for Hume, we do this by adopting a more general point of view, while also building on views in our society. But looked at from the perspective of outsiders to a white privileged Western society, the issue can seem much more fraught. So says Anne. Here's Mia Sosa Provencio deepening that problem. This is a quote from one of our articles. She's working in education, so she's making observations about educational policy, educational practice. So she points out, young people of color who find themselves on the margins of schooling continue to cry out for a healing, resistant, and historicized critical ethic of care that goes beyond the individualized, maternal, and emotive caring, largely characteristic of the white feminist ethic of care that dominates the discursive and physical spaces of mainstream schooling. And so the concern is, if we want to develop sympathetic understanding, we have blind spots, right? And it's sometimes hard to, if you have blind spots, it's hard to know that you have them and hard to know how to correct them. So this is the kind of problem. So how do we go about doing that? If we want to, train the heart mind by reflection to get sympathetic understanding, to get compassion, to be benevolent and humane, how do we do that when we have these potential blind spots? And this is just part of an answer. This is taken from an article Marissa and I co-wrote. The issue comes with the virtue of relational humility. So this is a virtue in contemporary virtue epistemology. Relational humility consists in recognizing not merely the limits of our own understanding. We all recognize we have limits. But also the epistemic authority of those whom one is striving to understand. So there's a kind of knowing to whom do I defer when getting information about vaccines. Like I know to whom I defer when getting information about what I need to do for my department. I know to whom to defer. When getting education about blind spots for moral inclusion, I have to know to whom to defer. What makes humility relational is the joint recognition of one, one's own epistemic limitations, and two, the ability of others to supply what one lacks, such that one is disposed to say, I don't know, but you tell me where I've gone wrong. Right? And I don't think this should be particularly controversial. I think this happens all the time in friendships, but it can be particularly acute, right? So I did not have some of the experiences my wife had growing up, right? In terms of the way, being picked on for being, in her case, being Korean, right, or being Asian. So knowing, to whom to defer, right? Having caring enough to ask, I think, is part of the issue that's going on with relational humility, right? If we want to develop sympathetic understanding, have sympathetic, compassionate hearts, and develop the virtue of humanity or benevolence, one of the things we have to do is we have to care enough to ask. Right? A second thing we have to do is we have to care enough to listen. Right? So relational humility helps us learn to care enough to ask and to care enough to listen. Not something, by the way, that's present in Hume. I think this is a problem in Hume. So I think there's a lot of really great stuff one can learn and take away from Hume. But there are, Hume had blind spots. And so we have to sort of, if there's something new to learn from Hume, it's going to have to be complemented by other insights, the way we do things with, in philosophy at least, with supplementing Aristotelian insights on Aristotelian virtues, virtue and moral psychology, by engaging, contemporary science and contemporary insights from other ethical traditions. So caring enough to ask is important. Caring enough to listen is part of solving this problem of moral inclusion. But neither of those are going to be enough if we don't, because asking and listening aren't enough for benevolence or humanity. You have to care enough to act, right? And so this is where things I thought got particularly interesting for me in ways that were surprising. I did not anticipate this. Some things I anticipated going into the project, some things I did not anticipate going into the project. So I made this move. Adam's making a move, sadly, from California to Oklahoma this summer, last last summer I made a shorter move. I just moved from the philosophy department to the honors college on the org chart. And so I had to do a little background reading. So David Weeks is a cruel and despotic taskmaster. So now I have to do all this reading going into my summer. And a lot of it came from reading these figures, who are all figures that appear on the sort of in the honors college curriculum. Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, James Baldwin, Martin Luther King. So I'm reading these things, getting in preparation for my teaching in the fall. Some of that was stuff that we were either was teaching or were planning to teach, or just I knew that students would have engaged would have engaged or would be engaging in other classes. So I'm doing that. But I'm a philosopher, and a lot of stuff is new to me, so it's helpful to have a philosopher who's a tour guide. So I'd spend my mornings and afternoons reading and writing. I'd spend my lunchtime, I would eat lunch, I'd sit down, and I would sit down with Cornel West, Brother West, as first to be called. And I would listen to a series of lectures that he gave at Dartmouth on a bunch of African-American social thought. So including these figures, the ones that we were looking at there, and others. So he also turned my attention to Anna Julia Cooper, Toni Morrison. I was also doing some of my own work, just prepping for my ethics class. I had to engage Africana philosophy and John Mbiti and Vincent Lloyd. I'd be blanking out might be getting his name wrong. Vincent Lloyd, I think it's Vincent Lloyd, has a book on African American natural law, Black natural law. Is the title of this book, which is a fantastic book, sort of highlighting the way in which classical natural law theory was adopted in the 18th century, the 19th century, and used in the abolitionist movement, and in the 20th century, and used in the civil rights movement. So I'm doing all of those things. Cornel West is particularly great because he's in sort of helping me here, because he is deeply, deeply imbued in the humanities, and he sees the sort of beauty of the humanities, the connection among a bunch of different texts. He moves from talking about the short stories of Anton Chekhov to talking about Plato, talking about Toni Morrison, and using all that stuff to highlight stuff that's going on in the debate between Washington and Du Bois. He is excellent at sort of contextualizing these figures, and I think he does so in a way that is really helpful for cultivating both charity in reading and critique in reading. So it was extremely helpful. One of the things as I'm doing all of that is seeing a theme emerge that I did not expect to see, and it has to do with the use of the use and understanding of sympathy. What happened was I read Douglass, then Washington, then Du Bois, and it was really when I was reading Du Bois that I noticed like his emphasis on sympathy. Then I went back and looked at Douglass and Washington. So I'm just doing it in this order because this is chronological, but it was really Du Bois who really got me thinking about this. So there's a point at which Booker T. Washington is mentioning a figure that was particularly prominent in his development, both in getting an education and in becoming an educator. And he says, I do not hesitate to say that I never met any man who, in my estimation, was the equal of General Armstrong. He was the leader of the Hampton Institute. I shall always remember that the first time I went into his presence, he made the impression upon me of being a perfect man. One might have removed from Hampton all the buildings, classrooms, teachers, and industries, and given the men and women there the opportunity of coming into daily contact with General Armstrong. And that alone would have been a liberal education. What was interesting to me about his appreciation of Armstrong is that he recognizes in Armstrong someone who is deeply sympathetic for others and deeply selfless in his service. Or he is a kind of, by Washington's estimation, Armstrong is at Hampton a kind of model servant, kind of servant leadership, or what we call servant leadership. And then I look back, and there's all these figures in Washington's life where he mentions their sympathy for him, right? Not just pity, but like what psychologists call empathic concern, right? Washington's mother was sympathetic with Washington's desire to get an education. Mrs. Ruffner, one of the first leaders of one of the first schools he comes to, is sympathetic with his desire to get an education. I mentioned Armstrong. As Washington goes not only from being educated, but to educator, his work at Tuskegee, George Campbell, Lewis Adams, Collins, Huntington are all sympathetic with his work at Tuskegee. And so this theme of sympathy, not merely as a kind of fellow feeling, but as a kind of empathic concern characterized by solidarity is big. Du Bois, this was really one of the quotes that struck me when I was reading The Souls of Black Folk last summer. The 19th century was the first century of human sympathy, he says. The age when half wonderingly we began to descry in others that transfigured spark of divinity which we call myself. When clodhoppers and peasants and tramps and thieves and millionaires and sometimes Negroes became throbbing souls whose warm pulsing life touched us so nearly that we half gasped with surprise, crying, "Thou too? Hast thou seen sorrow in the dull waters of hopelessness? Hast thou known life?" And this focus that Du Bois has on sympathy as not just empathic concern, but a kind that leads to a kind of solidarity, a kind of shared life and purpose, I think is really profound. Another one, again from Du Bois. This is a comment he makes about when he's talking about the work of New England abolitionists. This was the gift of New England to the freed Negro, not alms, but a friend, not cash, but character. It was not and is not money these seething millions want, but love and sympathy, the pulse of hearts beating with red blood, a gift which today only their own kindred and race can bring to the masses, but which once saintly souls brought to their favored children in the crusade of the 60s, that finest thing in American history, and one of the few things untainted by sordid greed and cheap vainglory. The teachers in these institutions came not to keep the Negroes in their place, but to raise them out of the defilement of the places where slavery had wallowed them. The colleges they founded were social settlements, homes where the best sons of the freedmen came in close and sympathetic touch with the best traditions of New England. They lived and ate together, studied and worked, hoped and hearkened in the dawning light. In actual formal content, their curriculum was doubtless old-fashioned, but in educational power, it was supreme, for it was the contact of living souls. So this emphasis on sympathy, not merely as fellow feeling, but as sympathy as solidarity, was really hugely sort of influential in my thinking about what is missing, I don't know if it's entirely missing from, but what is at least missing in emphasis from Hume and Confucianism. So there's this issue that I'm trying to think about in the end of the book about the connection between sympathy as empathic concern and sympathy as solidarity, right? So in Hume and Confucianism, we see a particular emphasis, not an exclusive emphasis, but a particular emphasis on sympathy as empathic concern. You see this also in contemporary psychology in the work of Dan Batson and others. You see this also in contemporary feminist ethics of care in the work of Nell Notting and others, this work of sympathy as kind of empathic concern. But one of the things I think that was really enriching my project is the encounter with African-American social philosophy and the thinking of sympathy not merely as empathic concern, but as sympathy as solidarity. So that I find sort of deeply enriching. So those two themes, empathic concern and solidarity. I'm now going to bring this to a close roughly on time. Okay. So I want to close by just highlighting, I think, two benefits here, these things that have been beneficial to me. So two benefits that sort of have come out of, for me, at least my sabbatical research so far. The first is an enriched philosophical landscape, right? Deeply enriched philosophical landscape. So I began here, right, with Hume. That was the person on whom I wrote my master's thesis. Started trying to think more recently about reading Hume methodologically in light of Confucianism. What kind of themes stand out if we read Hume in light of Confucianism? And that over the summer, because of my teaching prep for the Honors College, brought me to African-American social philosophy. right? And so for me, one of the things that's been great is just seeing this deeply enriched philosophical landscape. So that's deeply personal, partly because it's my work, this is what I do, but also because when I look and I see those figures, you know, I don't just see a bunch of philosophers and you know, people who are academics. I look on that screen and I see my family. I look on that screen and I see my friends. So one of the things that's been influential is that there's something deeply enriched philosophical landscape, which is not just important to me for my work, but because it's important because I love my family and I love my friends. But it's also important to me because I love my faith. And I think that the kind of thoughts that I'm engaging in this sabbatical project, one of the things I hope that you can take away, is to think more deeply about genuine Christian communion, right? Communion is union with, right? Solidarity, union with others, and thinking more about what my colleagues in the School of Theology call orthocardia, not merely orthodoxy, right? What is a merciful heart? It's the heart's burning desire for the sake of the entire creation, for men, for birds, for animals, for every created thing, because of the great compassion that burns without measure in one's heart in the likeness of God. It's the experience of having a sabbatical that allows me to think about these things that makes me sort of deeply grateful to God for what I do. And I'm grateful for you for coming and taking the time to listen. So thank you. And we have, look at that, right at 12:45, as Don instructed me. I was deeply worried about my ability to actually close on time. But there you have it. Okay, so.
Well, you didn't really close yet. We're pausing here.
No. I mean, ended my part.
Yeah, give people a chance to collect their thoughts and ask questions. Sorry.
Yes, if you have questions. I also take complaints. Philosophers like complaints. Complaints help us to think more clearly about our stuff.
I'll start just while people are thinking. But be sure to jump in after this, the rest of you. I'm asking you a question about your process as a philosopher, because you did your thesis and your dissertation on Hume, your PhD and master's, and then this sabbatical talk, and a lot of your presentations and articles revolve around Hume, like you mentioned even. So is he like as a philosopher, do you like start with him in your thinking, and then it seemed like, and then you moved out, you use his thinking and his writings as almost like an idea board, and brought in Eastern and African American thoughts and stuff like that. Is that the process, or did it just happen that way?
Yeah. So I think there's two things going on. So one is it's just some of it's happenstance. So when I went to graduate school, what I wanted to study was ancient Greek philosophy. That's what I wanted to study. But when I went to Utah, Nick White, who taught ancient Greek philosophy, was on sabbatical, and I was only planning to be there 2 years, and to not have someone that I'm going to have to be writing my master's thesis. So I thought, okay, well, I'm not going to go to Utah to study with Nick, ancient philosophy. I'm not going to get a chance to do that in the time frame I want to do that in. And it just so happened that a guy who was just a fantastic philosopher named Don Garrett was at Utah at the time. He's at NYU now, but he was there, and I took a class on him with Hume, and I hated Hume as an undergrad. I was one of my least favorite philosophers. Yeah, I know, Christine. In fact, when I went, I had a friend who asked me about, going to grad school, and I remember I was standing in the church parking lot at First Baptist Church in Fountain Valley. He said, "You should go to grad school." I said, "What would I do?" "You should study philosophy." I said, "What would I do?" "I have no idea." You could study the modern period, 17th, 18th century. It's all about like religion and science. You love that stuff. I said, I hate those figures. I don't want to study those guys. And Hume was one of my least favorite. But then it's interesting when you study a figure with someone who is excellent at understanding the figure and deeply appreciates the figure, right? You can gain new insight. So I gained new insight into Hume just as a thinker by working with Don Garrett. The other thing that was interesting for me, though, was that there was an aspect of there's one aspect of Hume's philosophy is his critique of religion in general and of Christianity in particular. That didn't resonate with me at all. I think it's important stuff to engage, but it didn't resonate with me at all. What resonated with me was his moral philosophy. This, I wrote my thesis on the connection between sympathy and benevolence. So in some ways, everything since has been footnotes on the master's thesis, right? So this idea of the connection between sympathy and benevolence in Hume, that interested me in part because it resonated with my religious life. That's what, I met my beautiful wife when I was thinking about, I was a Roman Catholic at the time, I was thinking about becoming a priest. I was thinking about becoming a Capuchin Franciscan friar because the Franciscans were motivated by compassion to serve the poor. So I think there's a part of reading Hume that just, despite our differences, Hume's and I, between Hume and I, me, Hume and me, despite our differences, he identified something that struck me as exactly right about human nature, right? About being motivated to care, motivated to benevolence by sympathy or compassion. So now I'm not one of these people who thinks like I shape all my thoughts around this one figure, like I'm a Thomist or I'm a Humean. To me, it's like, what ideas are good ideas? Let's engage those ideas. It's one of the reasons I think some of my work has been eclectic, right? It's like what ideas are good ideas? Let's go to those, right? I mean, you start from where you start, but I'm interested in what ideas are good ideas, and if Confucian ideas are good ideas, I want to engage those ideas, and if they are interesting in light of the stuff I happen to be doing research on with Hume, then I want to do that even more. Well, long answer to a short question. Sorry. Yeah, Christine.
It seems like with Mencius, you're dealing with rulers and leaders and people of power calling for heart mind. And then your contemporary examples come from places of suffering, like the African American community in the US and feminist care ethics. Can you comment a little bit on why it's the rulers in one and not the rulers in the other?
That's a really fascinating question. I haven't thought much about this. So now, I don't know. That is interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I honestly don't know, Christine. Now you've done this thing which is cool for me in terms of like long-term development, but not so cool for me in terms of like having a cool answer. I'll just say this: that one of the things that I tell my students is ideas have histories, right? So it's important to sort of tease out. Where do these ideas come from, right? So there's certain things that we tend to take for granted that if we tease it out, we might find out this isn't the way it's always been, right? But I do think it's very interesting for me to think about, why is it now that our discourse about political rulers is not shaped by benevolence? So it's interesting, right? Because when you see it in Mencius. Right? Sorry, you're see. I think I appeared this way on your screen. So going from this side of the timeline to the other, you see it in Mencius in China. You see it in Erasmus right. That leadership should be benevolent. So from Mencius to Erasmus, you see leadership should be benevolent. But somehow in the last couple hundred years, you get this move away from leadership as being benevolent. I think it's probably coming out of the religious wars in Western Europe. And then the kind of classical libertarian themes of de-emphasizing positive, what philosophers call positive moral obligations, and emphasizing negative ones. Just leave people alone. So that's sort of absent. So that's sort of my on the fly sort of answer to what seems to have gone on historically. But I think it's interesting, right? Because if I mention Erasmus or Mencius, and that political leadership should be benevolent, you get two kinds of no, please don't response, right? One is the concern, the kind of classical libertarian concern with leave me alone, and then there's the sort of there's a kind of contemporary liberal or left concern with patriarchy. If the government starts being benevolent, we're going to start getting something nasty happening to us. It's sort of deeply ingrained, I think, in the American psyche. So that's a shorter but lower quality answer to another good question. So that's going to require coffee, Christine, and more thought. I meant coffee to share a conversation over, not coffee like I need coffee now. I'm doing quite fine.
That's how I took it.
Yeah, Louise.
I actually wrote down a similar question as Christine asked. I was very intrigued and wonder if there's, and you don't have to answer this because you kind of touch upon it, but I was also thinking along the lines of how does is there any correlation between the understanding of sympathy? Because the group that you mentioned and highlighted at the end were the ones whom I also wrote down suffering or, oppressed even. So there's something there. But as you brought up about, Near East examples of leaders, I'm just thinking with my very limited recollection of Chinese history that in ancient Chinese culture, politicians and leaders are often scholars. They are thought leaders. That's definitely not the case today. So in comparison, and we are in a changing world, that's probably accentuated by this last year. So how would you anticipate thought leaders having these kind of values such as benevolence being added or subtracted from leadership, or something along the lines that Christine mentioned as well?
Yeah, I'm going to have to be careful here, Louise, because one of the things that I think is deeply worrisome is how much an emphasis there has come to be on just technique, right? Just technique, leadership as kind of technique, leadership as function, leadership devoid of the humane, leadership devoid of the humanities, right? I think that in you mentioned sort of classical Chinese culture. I mean, I think for like a millennia or more, right? It was just expected reading to read. It was expected for leaders to read the Analects, for readers to read the Mengzi, right? There and there's other works. There's 4 or 5 kind of classic works, right? There's 4 or 5 classic works, 4 or 5 great books, right? That would be read by Chinese leaders, and I think there's been this unfortunate turning away, I think, from that. In the 1980s, Stephen Covey had published The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and that was sort of a pushback in the business world, a pushback against leadership as technique, right, and trying to cultivate virtue. But I don't. In some ways, I think that doesn't catch on, right? And it's one of the things I think that's. I mean, the way that students, when they come into the honors college, is one of the first things they read is Machiavelli, right? Leadership is technique, leading by fear and coercion, right? And students, it's like, I've only done this once now since I've only had one fall, but one of the things that's like really disturbing is how many beautiful Christian souls, beautiful 18-year-old Christian souls will read Machiavelli and call him a realist. Well, he's a realist. I think he kills his friends, right? It's just like, that's not a realist, right? That's a despot, right? And so there's something about, something culturally about people, it's like we can't even recognize, like, we're raising people such that they can't even recognize their blind spots and sort of like there are things they haven't read and need to read, right? And we think that if we just credential them and give them some techniques, they'll be good. And I think that is not the case. That is, I mean, if anything, what recent American political history should be showing us, it is absolutely not the case, right? Plato has this concern with democracy that it devolves into tyranny without engaging virtue. And so in the Republic, one of the things Plato's deeply concerned with is that the populace, the leaders aren't learning virtue, right? They're not being trained in virtue. And so if you don't have a kind of emphasis on virtue, a sort of communitarian ethic, you will end. I do think that's a worry I have. Like, what will we in our lifetime? Will we see a significant devolution in American political life because we've abandoned this engagement with the kind of virtues that were characteristic of classical Confucian philosophy, of Roman philosophy, of Greek philosophy, of medieval European philosophy of, say, folks like Erasmus. I think it's really worrisome. Sorry, well, again, sort of long answer, but I think it's a hugely important issue. And I think if this is why I think it's very important that at APU that we have not just fantastic credentialing in our professional programs and not just great chapels, right, that move people, right, but students who are deeply, deeply imbued in the life of the mind, and they learn to love God with their whole mind and their whole heart, united, shin, the heart mind, their whole heart mind. If we abandon that, I think that I hope the university recovers from now its second once in a lifetime financial crisis. But honestly, I'll just be honest. Yeah, I think if the university abandons that and just becomes a credentialing program that doesn't train thought leaders to engage the greatness of human thought, I think the university will be failing to raise genuine Christian leaders. So, on that happy note.
Yeah, well, that's actually a very good place to stop. It's very sober and thoughtful comments there. A very good question, and yeah, just something to take home and really think about and remember what you said. And I think I mentioned that I would put the ORG YouTube channel there where this talk will be uploaded here within a day or two. There's previous talks from the semester that are up there. So anyway, we really want to thank you, Rico, for really a thoughtful presentation. And on behalf of the Office of Research and Grant, just want to let you know, rather than me giving you an envelope with a little thank you card in it, I'll just say verbally that we've made arrangements to make a small donation to an upcoming pay period for you. So if you see a small boost, it's not permanent. It's not from HR, it's from us, and it's a one-time thing. But really appreciate the talk and look forward maybe to looking at it again up on the YouTube. So thanks everybody too for coming out and showing your support for this endeavor.
Great,
Okay,
thanks so much, Don. I really appreciate it. Thank you everyone for coming. I appreciate you taking time. I know you're busy, so I appreciate it a lot.
Okay, bye-bye.
Really good talk.